There's been cyclical waves of protest by Tibetans against Chinese rule ever since the Chinese took over Tibet 60 years ago. Some of those protests, especially in the late 50s and 60s, were military, guerrilla warfare and so on, very serious military attacks on China. They failed. Then in the 80s there was street protests across much of central Tibet. And then since 2008 we have a new wave of protests. Those new protests have been marked in about 20% of cases by violence, almost always against government property, but on one occasion against Chinese people. And the immolations are significant because they're a form of protest that does not run the risk of running down into violence. They only violence against themselves, not against other people. Much harder, therefore, for China to present them on its television programs and in its rhetoric as criminal acts, as it did with the protests. And much more resonant for Tibetan people. These immolations relate to a Buddhist tradition of self-sacrifice and dedication. But they're very difficult for the exile leadership. The exile leaders don't seem to know quite how to respond. They don't want to tell them to stop. According to their own ideas, they're opposed to them. They don't approve of violence even against the self. And they shouldn't be supporting people killing themselves in their own name. And yet the leaders don't want to interfere with people's protests and their right to protest. One of the hidden stories of Chinese communist history, which is what we're talking about when we think about Chinese politics, is that they clearly have never even imagined that it's possible to rule a non-Chinese people, like Tibetans or Uyghurs or Mongols, without having a local traditional leader to be your mediator, your spokesman, your supporter. And in almost all cases, and especially the Tibetan case, the leader that the Chinese have to find to speak on their behalf, their proxy, is a religious leader, a lama in the Tibetan case. And the strangest story of all is that the Chinese communists have, for decades, since at least the 1940s, tried to select Tibetan children and groom them to be future lamas, even using statements by them when they're 10 or 11 years old, to justify, that's how they justified the original move of the Communist Party's army into Tibet by a telegram from a lama who was then 11 years old. And the same pattern is happening now. They're still trying to find a religious Tibetan leader who they can groom to say that China is the rightful owner of Tibet and that Tibetans should follow them. They've tried this several times. It hasn't succeeded so far. They're trying it now with the young Panchen Lama, now in his early 20s. He doesn't seem to be accepted by most Tibetan people. They're certainly going to try it by appointing the next Dalai Lama when the current one dies, and that will lead to more conflict. We really don't know what's going to happen with the new leadership. We don't know how much Xi Jinping, the expected leader, might be influenced by his father's record of a slight amount of relative moderation towards the Tibetan question. But we also don't know that those changes, a more moderate shift, is impossible. That could happen at any time in the Chinese system. It's not really easy to predict either way. Strategically, it's really central to relations between the giants of Asia, the Russia, China, and India, the last two particularly, and the Indo-China border, which is the Tibetan border, is still a militarized border that hasn't been settled, that's seen at least one war and has nearly broken out in war on other occasions in the last 40 years. This is a very live issue that is very sensitive, and it's also, Tibet is the water source for the Mekong, the Brahmaputra, the Irrawaddy, the Salween, the Yangtze, many other rivers that feed Asia. And in the times of global warming, these water issues become more and more significant. But there's a long way to go, even for the Americans, to find a vocabulary within which they can communicate important ideas to China that will work for the international community and that won't be threatening to the Chinese. The Dalai Lama has given up his claim for independence in the future. Most Tibetans seem committed to non-violence. Many Tibetans seem to be essentially pragmatic. Of course, not all of them, some are more radical. But between the Tibetans and the Chinese, if they could be persuaded to sit down and talk, if the Chinese had the political will to solve the Tibetan issue, there's very little space, very little distance between the two leaderships.